This content may be upsetting, disturbing, or traumatic for some viewers, so I just wanted to give a heads up. Thank you.
Mothers, don't you know the pain you've caused your sons? Daddies, don't you know some hurts can't be undone? So be careful what you sow, they gonna reap it soon. Just be careful or they'll end up just like you. Mothers, hold your daughters and your sons. Fathers, show your children how to love. You gotta take their hands to lift them up again. Love your children, love your children.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Legacy Trauma Creates. In this episode, we will discuss how trauma affects children. Some of the information that I gave before may be repeated in this episode, but please bear with me. I feel that it's important to go into this in order because it reflects the very nature of families. And when it comes to children, they inherit a lot from their parents. The passing down of trauma is an inheritance that no one wants. And in this episode, we will really talk about the legacy that it builds and creates in children. Before a child is born, their mother is born, and her mother is born before her. When your mother was a fetus inside of your grandmother's womb, she developed all the eggs she would ever produce, including yours. That means your egg and your mother's fetus were both inside of your grandmother's womb at the same time. Men, including your father, began to produce sperm after puberty, and they continued developing sperm well into their elderly years. With this being said, any trauma that your grandmother endured while pregnant with your mother and your egg also endured. And with your father, any trauma that he endured up until the point of your conception had the potential to affect the sperm that will help to develop you. Any experience that happens during the time where the brain is developing can cause epigenetic alterations. These changes can influence key genes in a child's health, personality, and overall development. A researcher by the name of Rachel Yehuda conducted a study on the children of women pregnant during the Dutch famine in World War II. Her and her team found that those children had a number of effects ranging from extreme stress to cardiovascular issues, depending on the trimester of exposure. There have also been several studies on the emotions of pregnant mothers that affects their unborn children. According to Dr. Bruce Lipton, referenced in It Didn't Start With You, a mother's emotions can biochemically alter the genetic expression of her offspring. In a study by Gerard Rotman, a researcher of the University of Salzburg, Austria, he discovered that pregnant women with negative attitudes had the most critical medical problems during their pregnancy, and their babies were the most emotionally disturbed and were born premature. A study by Monica Lukash on the attitudes of mothers towards their unborn children revealed that the children born to mothers that had rejected them were drastically less healthy physically and emotionally than children whose mothers were excited for them. These studies, along with others, show that trauma can begin before a child is even born. Unfortunately, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration National Traumatic Stress Initiative reported that more than 2/3 of children by age 16 have already experienced at least one traumatic event. The traumatic events could have been any forms of abuse, witnessing or experiencing violence, loss of a loved one, assault, neglect, refugee or war experiences, or commercial sexual exploitation, and also any others that I've mentioned before in previous episodes. By the time I was 16, I was suicidal, I had been raped. I had been beaten. I had been molested. And I would say also emotionally neglected in a sense. Maybe not all the time, but enough had happened that damage was done. I had witnessed domestic abuse. I am from the projects, so like you could hear gunshots like throughout the day, at nighttime. My house had been shot at before. My house had been robbed before. I had lost family members to sickness, old age, murder. And it's a lot. And one of the things that I found interesting, I guess, is that sometimes you get used to those things that you don't even realize that this isn't normal. It's just something that you go through. Like I was raped once, and the molestation came back very recently in a memory, and it just kind of, it really messed me up because I had to process that. I had this really bad habit that when I would become anxious, I would just put something in my mouth. Like either when I was younger, I would bite my nails to the nubs. And middle school and high school, I remember I used to wear necklaces a lot. And like I would just, when I become anxious, I would do like this. And then like all of a sudden I would just, whatever it was, I'd start biting on it. I would also, like, I always had gum. And so like I would just open up a pack of gum and just like, I would put a whole bunch, so much to the point where like I looked like a chipmunk. And if I didn't do that, like I would just chew it so consistently to the point where it turned into paste. And I just didn't know why I was anxious. I didn't know why I would do that. Like a lot of the times I just felt like I just needed something in my mouth. Like and I didn't know where it came from. And then one day it was brought back. And in that moment, it was a lot of emotions. Like, I still can't remember the person who did it. I just remember the act. I remember it happening. And it just broke my heart because it was like, how could this happen? How could this happen? And I not know it? How could this happen and I not remember it? Not only that, the same person who molested me was not the same person who also raped me. Like that happened. The molestation happened when I was younger. The rape happened when I was 13. And that person was a friend of the family. But it's just, trauma happens and it's unfortunate. And even though the report says that most people by the age of 16 endure one traumatic event, in poverty areas, the people there have a constant chain of events happening. Like just going outside or going to school is a traumatic event. Not to mention what goes on in their homes. In The Blues of Vulnerability, Love and Healing Black Youth by Sean A. Jenwright, he said that the term PTSD was inadequate to capture the depth, scope, and frequency of trauma in a child's neighborhood. pretty much kind of like the one where I was from. And he was saying that a lot of children in their neighborhoods, in their homes, they have not, instead of PTSD, but PTSE, persistent traumatic stress environments. And he was just saying, because this is a daily living thing, it can lead to PTSD being diagnosed as a disorder, having a past experience. But as long as you're living in it, PTSD doesn't quite grasp the scope of what's happening. It doesn't quite give you the sum of all that it incorporates when a child has that many traumatic experiences on a day-to-day level. And with that being said, childhood trauma can have a lifelong impact on the mental health, and it can lead into anxiety, depression, bipolar disorders, and actually PTSD. It can also create physical health issues with type 2 diabetes, autoimmune disease, poor dental health, obesity, and gastrointestinal symptoms. Childhood trauma has also been shown to decrease a lifespan up to 20 years. Trauma also impacts children differently. As I've said before, two people can experience the same thing and still have very different reactions to it. So don't compare your experience to someone else, even if you've been through the same event together or a similar traumatic event. This is also due to our genes. It can be due to the environment and also the behaviors of the parents. For example, many psychological symptoms and emotional dysregulations are linked with negative parenting behaviors, and emotional regulation is critical and impactful to great parenting. Parents that have been persistently exposed to trauma tend to have difficulties with emotional regulation, and this creates a deficit in the children. The children then have a lack of understanding emotions and being aware of them. They may struggle with accepting their emotions and may not resist impulsive behaviors when dealing with negative emotions. They may also have difficulties connecting with their parents, especially if the parent is distant, insensitive, abusive, or dismissive towards them. However, children learn to adapt to survive. It was discovered by Mary Main and Mary Ainsworth and their team that when infants are not securely connected to their mothers, they show certain reactions when upset. They discovered that when a mother dislikes touching her infant, two things seem to happen. Some of the infants began to seem as though nothing bothered them. When their mother left them, they didn't cry for her, and when she returned, they act as if she wasn't there. While the opposite effect resulted in others. The infants would begin yelling and crying when the mother was around, and her attempts to console them would not work. Main also uncovered during her studies that a key problem for some young children she studied didn't feel safe around their parents. Their parents were the source of their trauma and distress, and they felt as if they had no one to turn to. These children tend to become inattentive and detached or aggressive as they grew older. Another thing that was noticed were the results were the same if the child wasn't abused, but if the parent was distracted from their own traumas. A parent that had inconsistent behaviors and was emotionally unstable created an environment where the child did not feel safe, thus forming a traumatic experience for that child. For example, in Depression in Parents, Parenting, and Children, it was stated that depression is significantly associated with more hostile, negative parenting and with more disengaged parenting. Depressed parents are associated with children having poor health and well-being. It could also lead to a more difficult temperament, insecurities, low self-esteem, and lower cognitive and academic performance in our children. Children in middle childhood have described living with a depressed parent as stressful due to their unpredictable behaviors, their irritability, and their lack of warmth and affection. S.S. Jaser and his team observed during a study that some depressed parents would often withdraw from their child or wouldn't respond to their child's needs, while others would become over-involved in the lives of their children and become hostile towards them. They also observed that some parents alternated between the two, creating disorganized attachments with their children. A disorganized attachment is defined by Rachel Green as being characterized by an extreme desire to be in an intimate relationship while simultaneously being intensely afraid of actually being in such a relationship. Mary Main described it in children as being unable to approach their parents, being unable to shift their focus from their parents, nor being unable to get away from their parents. Bessel van der Kolk described it as fright without a solution. I believe that, well, let me start this way. One of the things I didn't necessarily have words for was, I guess, a disorganized attachment. So my dad, growing up, because I lived with him, he was always this no-nonsense kind of guy. And I would say growing up that it seemed like he would do just enough. One of the things he used to tell me and my the people in the house, especially, I guess I'll say for a fact, especially me, is all I got to do is put food in your stomach, a roof over your head, and clothes on your back. That's it. That's all I got to do. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that the bare minimum was not enough. Like, it still isn't enough. I didn't have words to say that, hey, I need more. I want more. I didn't know how to put that into words. Like, at some point, it got to a place where I didn't feel like I deserved more. I felt like I got what I got. That was it. And just wanting, I don't know. Like, I think part of it is that I wanted to reach out. Like, I know, especially when I was younger, like, I was very angry, but at the same time, like, I really wanted to talk to my dad, and not just about the things that he was always interested in. It seemed like whenever we talked, it was always about video games, stocks, and comic books or movies. And I'm like, I like other stuff. I don't want to talk about this. And even still, it just felt surface level. Even as a kid, I think I've always liked very deep, in-depth conversations. But like, there were just surface level things that was difficult for me. It would just, and I think it was just difficult. I think part of the reason I couldn't have those conversations with my dad wasn't necessarily always my dad. I think it was also the lack of trust that I felt for him, like towards him. I did not trust my dad with my emotions. Like, I didn't trust my dad that he would keep me so safe. Like, I did not think my dad would ever intentionally hurt me. But for some reason in my mind, I could not trust him enough. My dad was not a safe place for me. And it's like I wanted to be with him. Like, I wanted to talk to him and spend time with him and get to know him. But there was always this barrier there. Part of it was fear. Part of it was anger. Part of it was the lack of trust. Part of it was something I probably still don't have words for. And we just didn't have that. And I think part of it also is that I would say my harshness for the way that I used to speak a lot, I learned it from him. Like, I would definitely say my dad was not a gentleman with his words. And as I got older, like, he definitely tried. Like, I saw him change and try, and I see him still changing and trying. It's just that when I was younger, my dad was also younger. He had me at 17 or 18. So he was growing up at the same time I was growing up. And so, like, when I think about the things that happened, I can give him grace for that. And I can still say, hey, what you did hurt me. Like, I understand that you didn't know. Like, you were trying to figure it out. And there were consequences for that. There were reactions. Like, those things really hurt me. Like, and my dad, he was the type that when he get mad, he threatened. Like, there was a time in kindergarten, I'm probably 4 or 5. And it was nap time, and we had a substitute teacher. Because my teacher, I do remember this clearly. My teacher was out on maternity leave. I loved her. And the substitute we got, I always thought she was mean. I was afraid to ask her for anything extra. And she had told everyone to go use the bathroom. And I didn't have to go. I didn't have to go. So now it's nap time. And I'm laying down. And I really have to go. And I was terrified of asking her. I was a little chicken when I was small. I was scared of a lot. And I remember falling asleep. And when I woke up, I didn't have to go anymore. I peed in my sleep. And I was like jerked awake. Like, to like my dad's angry face. And he brought me a change of clothes. I think they called him off of work. I don't know. But he was pissed. And I remember him telling me that if you ever do some S like this again, I'm going to put my foot up your A. Like, that was his favorite thing. Like, whenever we would get in trouble, I'm going to stick my foot so far up your A or up your A. And it's just like, it would seem silly, but I heard that a lot. And I couldn't take it lightly. Like, for me, like, I couldn't take it as my dad just mad and talking, because I've also seen him get mad. And I've also seen him and my stepmom fight. So And to say that my dad always hit her first, I can't say that. Like, I don't have a distinct memory of that. I just know I remember seeing them go to blows. Because I remember asking about him, and he was saying that she would hit me first. But that's neither here nor there. What is important is that those threats, they implanted something in me that made it very difficult to trust my dad, to feel safe with him. Like, I was small, but like, I heard him. I saw him and my stepmom used to fight all the time. Not only that, when me and my sister used to get beatings, they sometimes left marks. It wasn't like a 1, 2, 3 pop. That's it. Like, no, like sometimes we got marks. Like, I want to say it was probably only 1 or 2 times that it was so bad we couldn't go to school. So even though I wanted to get to know my dad, like, it was very hard for me. And I was just angry for a long time. So that anger was part of a way for me to, like, try to, I'm not even exactly sure. I just know I didn't want to be afraid. Like, I didn't want to be afraid. So I became angry. And I remember around the time that I was in high school, and like, I was so angry that like that anger turned into hate. And like, I just hated my parents. Like, there was like a hate that was like so deep in me. Like, it actually scared me. And I was like, this doesn't feel right. Like, I know I'm angry, but like, why am I this angry to the point where I hate them? And that hatred just never sat right in me. And so I was just like, I don't want to hate them because I actually do love them. I just don't like them. And I don't know how to connect with them. And I don't know what to do. I was stressing myself out and becoming depressed, and I felt as though I was being a brat because my dad would often remind me that he was there. He wasn't in jail and he wasn't out getting high. He was there. And the thing is, I appreciated that he was there. Like, where we lived at, I saw how many dads weren't there. I saw how many dads were locked up or out in the streets. So like, I appreciated the fact that he was there. It's just, I also didn't know how to vocalize that him being there. I didn't know how to vocalize that I needed more than just him being there. And at the same time, I also know that if I had the words for it, I probably would have been too scared to tell him. Because even just asking for small things, like, I would come up with about 15 different worst case scenarios before I could work up the courage to ask him. And even still, like, I would always prepare for him to say no. Hopefully no and not anything else. And that's just the way my mind was. Like, I would try to ask him something, and in my heart and in my mind I would prepare for all these bad things. So if he just told me no, it would be a relief. But that was the way that my mind worked at that time. In the 1980s, Carlene Lyons Roof began to study disorganized attachments in high-risk families. She conducted a video study on the face-to-face interactions between mothers and their children. She observed them at different ages, starting at 6 months and ending around 7 or 8 years of age. Her observations revealed that disorganized attachment showed up in two ways. One set of mothers were too focused on their own problems to focus on their children, and they were often hostile or intrusive. They will also switch between rejecting the child and acting as if the child were supposed to be taking care of them. The other set of mothers seemed afraid and helpless. They were nice to their children, but they often didn't know how to be the adult and wanted the children to console them. The observation showed that the mothers did not act this way intentionally. They didn't even realize they were doing it. And upon further communication, the mothers themselves had childhood trauma. The hostile mothers had childhood trauma concerning witnessing domestic violence or were the recipients of physical abuse. The more dependent mothers had childhood trauma revolving around parental loss or sexual abuse. Over time, the videos began to reveal the children becoming more and more resistant, hostile, and dejected towards their mothers, while at the same time, the mothers progressively became more frustrated, hurt, sharp, and helpless while communicating with their children. When the children were around 20 years old, she did a follow-up study to see how they were managing. The children had become young adults that struggled with identity, self-worth, high-risk behaviors, excessive spending, intense anger, and intermittent suicidal behavior. Carlene discovered that the emotional withdrawal and role reversal were specifically connected to aggressive behaviors against others and themselves. Children of trauma may re-experience trauma. This can show up in a variety of ways, and one of those ways is by reenactments. Children will imitate the trauma they've experienced or witnessed. Sometimes this is done to overcome the trauma that happened. Sometimes it's a compulsive act to physically recreate the events. Reenactments can happen in the form of hypersexuality, self-harming behaviors, high-risk behaviors, or continuing to enter toxic relationships. As I've mentioned before, children that have endured trauma also learn to adapt. They have learned to become hyper-aware of even the slightest change in voices and faces. Any change in a negative way can be perceived as a possible threat due to the history of the trauma. They react to them as triggers for what could happen because in a bad situation, they can only imagine the worst possible outcomes. Bessel, Kolk, and Nina Fish-Murray created the Thematic Apperception Test, or TAT, cards for children. TAT cards are a set of cards used to reveal how a person's inner thoughts shape the view of their world. They conducted this study on 6 to 11-year-old children that had been abused by their families. They observed the traumatized children came up with morbid stories about the cards, while their control group had milder stories. For example, one of the cards revealed two children smiling while watching their father work on a car from under it. A child from the control group suggested that the car would get fixed and then they would go to McDonald's. However, one of the children from the traumatized group suggested that the boy kicked the jack away and the car mangled his father's body. Children of trauma also learn to adapt by managing to cope through the traumatic events. Coping mechanisms that children may gravitate towards are promiscuous sex, tobacco, alcohol, and substance abuse, overindulging, and driving recklessly, among many others. Another coping mechanism that we will talk about is dissociation. Dissociation happens when a person feels overwhelmed or disconnected from their reality. The feeling is so intense that a person can feel as though their mental state is separated from their physical state. People say that they feel as though they are looking down at their bodies while a traumatic experience is happening. They often feel as if the incident happened to someone else and they were the witnesses. Studies on dissociation has revealed that it is a learned behavior at a young age. Young adults and adults that have endured trauma later in life don't typically develop dissociative symptoms. It begins when a child learns to expect hostility or withdrawals from a parent. They learn to block out what's happening around them. However, their bodies do not relax in this state. Their bodies remain in a place of high alert in case of a physical attack or abandonment. Dissociation leads into depersonalization and derealization, causing the memories of traumatic events to become distant, fragmented, or even hazy. Mark Wolynn, in his book, It Didn't Start With You, said, "A well-documented feature of trauma, one familiar to many, is our inability to articulate what happens to us. Not only do we lose our words, but something happens with our memory as well. During a traumatic incident, our thought processes become scattered and disorganized in such a way that we no longer recognize the memories as belonging to the original event. Instead, fragments of memory disperse as images, body sensations, and words are stored in our unconsciousness and can become activated later by anything even remotely reminiscent of their original experience. Once they are triggered, it is as if an invisible rewind button has been pressed, causing us to reenact aspects of the original trauma in our day-to-day lives. Unconsciously, we could find ourselves reacting to certain people, events, and situations in old familiar ways that echo the past." Upon initially reading this paragraph, I thought Mark had summed up perfectly what happens during dissociation and how it plays a part with reenactments, and it piqued my curiosity. I hadn't looked into why talking about trauma is so difficult. I know from personal experiences that some of it is shame involved, and also denial and the inability to trust your memories, but I wondered if there was more. Looking into it, I discovered the word alexithymia, meaning no words for feelings. Alexithymia is having difficulty describing and identifying one's emotions. Children that have been on the receiving end of emotional abuse, emotional neglect, and physical abuse tend to become alexithymics. During a study, it was found that more men and boys struggle with alexithymia than women and girls. Alexithymics often can't tell what's going on with their emotions, even when their body can. They react to stressful situations by becoming angry or spacing out. This keeps the children from retelling traumatic experiences because they've learned to shut down their emotions. Their mind and body are now out of sync, so the mind can no longer register the emotions while the body does not forget them. Alexithymia, along with other things, may cause PTSD in children. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a mental disorder that develops after traumatic experiences. PTSD is associated with invasive memories, nightmares, dissociation, negative moods, anger, distress, and impaired functioning. Every child that experiences trauma is not diagnosed with PTSD. They are diagnosed if the symptoms continue after 1 month and they are keeping the child from functioning throughout their day. Children that are diagnosed with PTSD often have flashbacks. The traumatic memories rush in and debilitate them in the moment. The memories, once triggered, can replay the moment of trauma and overwhelm them with the sensations, emotions, sounds, and images of the event. Children of trauma can also have repressed memories. The loss of memory is connected to PTSD, but not always so. Memory loss is most common in childhood sexual abuse, but it's not limited to that. Other forms of trauma have created memory loss in children as well. Other forms of trauma have been known to create memory loss in trauma. Repressed memories have also been known to return. Researchers have discovered that more women who were molested when they were younger were more inclined to not remember their abuse. Researchers aren't exactly sure why the memories return. Sometimes they return due to triggers, and then sometimes they just come back on their own. When the memories return, they can be clear or fragmented, and they often bring about mental and emotional turmoil for the person, and even in extreme cases, physical health concerns. As I said before, when the memory of me being molested came back, it was a lot to grasp. It was surprising because I didn't expect it. Nor was it just, it wasn't triggered either. It was more like, why do I do this thing that I do? And the more I thought about it, it came back. As I end this episode, I would like to say something that I've already said before. Anything unhealed will bleed into the next generation. Almost everything you struggle with as an adult started when you were a child. Some parents made mistakes. Others remained unaware of what they were doing, while others still were deliberate in harming you. How it happened is how it happened. I don't say this to diminish the pain that you're going through or to overlook the trauma that you're feeling. I say this because I want you to take the next step. I want you to heal. I especially want you to heal if you're a parent, because your trauma passes down to your children in a multitude of ways. I also especially want you to heal if you're someone's child, because you are worthy of living life where trauma is not a reflection of your identity. Your identity reflects your resilience and strength in knowing what you've been through and who you can become. In the next episode, I will talk more about healing from trauma. There's a lot of healing that you have to go through when you've been through trauma, but I know you can do it. I believe you can. I took the time out to do all of this because there are a lot of people hurting, and unfortunately, hurt people, knowingly and unknowingly, willingly and unwillingly. And I just don't want that to be you. So thank you for tuning in with The Legacy Trauma Creates. This is Monique Thompson, and I'll see you next time.
Mothers, hold your daughters and your sons.